So hello and welcome everyone to this next video of our 100 Days to CAT program, in which we'll be looking at critical reasoning. We'll understand the basics of what critical reasoning questions are all about and what kind of skills or what kind of knowledge do we need to require as the basic foundation to approach questions of this type. So first thing we'll understand is critical reasoning questions are basically about understanding and analyzing arguments. So what is the meaning of an argument? So generally when I ask students that what do you mean by an argument, the kind of answers that I get is that, sir, it's a disagreement between two different parties. Right? That is, of course, the colloquial meaning of the word argument. But in terms of literature, an argument need not always be a disagreement or a debate between two different parties. In fact, an argument is whenever someone makes a point, whenever someone comes with a conclusion, comes up with a conclusion, comes up with a course of action to be taken, comes up with a decision, then that person is presenting an argument. So when you have a certain amount of knowledge and you use that knowledge to come up with your own conclusions, you are presenting your own argument. So critical reasoning questions are all about understanding the author's arguments or understanding the character who's present inside the passage that you're reading, that person's arguments and conclusions. Right? So first thing that we have to understand to solve critical reasoning questions is the structure of an argument or the components of an argument. Right? So an argument is generally likened to a bridge. Why? Because there are three different parts of an argument, which basically is like a bridge connecting two different landmasses. So the first landmass from where you're starting is called the premise of the argument. So premise is basically the fact that the person who is presenting an argument knows. So suppose you are presenting an argument, then the fact that you know to be true is called your premise. Then from that premise, you make a certain set of assumptions. So you say that I know that this is true. Assuming a few other things to be true, you come up with the third part of your argument, which is your conclusion. Right? So conclusion is what you are finally inferring or concluding. So these three parts together is what forms an argument. So you know certain facts, then from those facts you make certain assumptions, and using the facts and a set of assumptions you come up with a conclusion, then you have presented an argument. So this entire thing, all these three components together is what forms a sense of an argument. Okay. Now, a lot of confusion is generally present among students about the second part, which is the part of assumptions. So what is an assumption? So sometimes students say that certain assumptions should not be mentioned directly inside a passage. Or some students will say that the assumptions need to be mentioned by the person who is putting up an argument inside the passage itself. So I say that neither of those are true, because assumptions are basically of two types. There are two types of assumptions. You've got implicit assumption, and pardon my really bad handwriting, and there are explicit assumptions. So implicit assumptions are assumptions which are implied inside the argument. So assumptions which are not directly mentioned by an author, but which are implied by the author, which means the assumptions which are going on in the mind of the author but not presented in written form, is called an implicit assumption. Or assumptions can be mentioned by the author directly in the write-up itself. They can say that assuming these things to be true, I come up with this conclusion. So assumptions can be implicit, which means not mentioned inside the passage directly, or explicit, which means mentioned directly, concretely in written text form inside the passage itself. So these three components together form an argument, and anytime you want to answer a critical reasoning questions, you will be able to get a really good percentage accuracy if you can determine what is the premise, what is the assumption, and what is the conclusion. Anyone who can successfully identify the three components of an argument will be able to analyze the argument successfully and will be able to answer critical reasoning questions which are with a much greater degree of accuracy than someone who does not understand what these three parts are inside an argument. So let's look at a few arguments and let's try to recognize which are the premise, assumptions, and conclusions inside a few of these arguments. So firstly, let me pick up, say, a very short argument. It's small arguments. So this argument says, Moby Dick is a whale, so Moby Dick is a mammal. So here the first part of the sentence, Moby Dick is a whale, is the premise. So Moby Dick is a mammal will be the conclusion. So the first part is the premise, the second part is the conclusion. And what is the assumption? The assumption here is that all whales are mammals, right? So we know, we have the knowledge that Moby Dick is a whale. That's a fact that is known to us. Assuming that whales are mammals, we can then conclude that Moby Dick is a mammal. So this is an argument. Right? Similarly, let's move on. Giving students a fail grade will damage their self-confidence. Therefore, we should not fail students. So clearly, I think everyone can figure out what the premise and conclusion here are. Right? Of course, words like therefore, hence, so, consequently, all of these determine the presence of a conclusion. So therefore, we should not fail students. This is the conclusion. The first sentence, giving students a fail grade will damage the self-confidence, is a premise. And the assumption that is implied, the implicit assumption inside this, of course, is that we should not be damaging the self-confidence of students. Right? Assuming that damaging self-confidence of a student is prohibited or it's not supposed to be done, then we can come up with a conclusion that students should not be failed. Right? Let's look at a few more. It should not be illegal for adults to smoke pot. After all, it does not harm anyone. So here we can see that the first sentence is in fact the conclusion. So several times students think that conclusion should be at the end, not necessary at all. The author might give the conclusion first and then the premise later on. And that is precisely what has happened in this third argument. The conclusion of the author is that it should not be illegal for adults to smoke pot. And the premise is, after all, it does not harm anyone. So the fact that the author knows is that smoking pot does not harm anyone. And the conclusion that he or she is arriving from there is that that is why it should not be illegal for adults to smoke pot. Right? So the assumption that is present in this particular argument is that anything that does not harm anyone else should not be illegal. Right? So for something to be illegal, it has to be harmful. So if something is not harmful, it should be legal. That is the assumption made by the author. Moving on, next argument says there is nothing wrong with talking on a mobile phone during lectures. Other students do it all the time. So once again, in this particular argument, first sentence is conclusion, second sentence is premise. Right? So assumption here, of course, is that whatever other students do or several students do, that is not something which is wrong. If several students do one thing, it is not something which is wrong. Right? So that is the implicit assumption present inside this argument. Moving on, killing an innocent person is wrong, therefore abortion is wrong. So again, in this first sentence becomes a premise and second sentence becomes a conclusion. And the implicit assumption present here is that abortion is equivalent to killing an innocent person. Right? Killing an innocent person is wrong, therefore abortion is wrong. So the assumption here is that abortion and killing an innocent person are in essence the same thing. All right, let's look at one more argument. Traces of ammonia have been found in Mars's atmosphere. So there must be life on Mars. So once again, second part is a conclusion here. First sentence is a premise. And the assumption I think all of you should be able to recognize now that if ammonia is present, life will be present. Right? So presence of ammonia indicates that there will be life. So that is the assumption that the author is making. And one more argument, last argument or last short argument, let's look at this. There cannot be more than one God. Otherwise, there would be two gods equally powerful or one is more powerful than the other. Okay. So the conclusion here, it's a bit tricky to understand in this last particular, last short passage. But the conclusion is the first sentence that there cannot be more than one God. Right? Why? Because the author's argument is that otherwise there would be two gods equally powerful or one is more powerful than the other. Okay. So there is not an explicit premise here. The premise here in the last argument is kind of missing, but that's okay. We will actually, moving forward in this particular video itself, we will understand that premise is not very important in getting a sense of understanding of an argument. Rather, conclusions and assumptions are the two most important parts of argument. So why I'm saying that we'll get a sense of understanding of as we move on with this video. But for now, we should understand that the conclusion of the author is that there cannot be more than one God. And why does he say that? He says that because otherwise there would be two gods equally powerful or one is more powerful than the other. Right? So one implicit assumption which is present here inside this argument, which has not been mentioned, is that God as a concept is someone who is all powerful. The most powerful person in this entire universe would be called God. Right? That is why the author says that if there are two gods, both will be equally powerful. So then there will not be one most powerful entity. So then if there is not one most powerful entity, then you cannot call that person or that being a god. Right? So this is the implicit assumption which is present inside the last argument. I hope all of these examples give you a general sense of an idea as to what is a premise, how does a premise look like, how does a conclusion look like, and how you can infer from the premise and conclusion as to what the assumptions are. Okay, so if these are clear, let's look at a slightly longer passage, right? Because if critical reasoning questions are asked in reading comprehension exercises, we won't get these two-line arguments and then finding out which is the premise and which is the conclusion and which is the assumption can become a bit tricky. So I'll give you about 30 seconds. Read this passage, take your time and read this passage. All right, so I hope good enough time for all of you to skim through this entire passage. So in this passage, the first paragraph is what? I think you should be able to understand that the first paragraph is the premise of the argument. Why is it a premise? Because it's a fact. It is factually telling us that how has the CAA NRC bill been designed? What are the nitty-gritties of the CAA NRC bill which was present or which has been presented as part of the legal system of India? What is the argument of the author, or what is the conclusion of the author? Conclusion of the author is the entirety of the second paragraph, where the author is saying that this particular bill is not going to work. Why is this bill not going to work? Because the author says that it is not possible for anyone to prove that they have entered illegally on or before December 31st. The author says that there are no illegal documents that someone can present to prove that they have entered India on or before December 31st, 2015. There are, of course, a lot of documents to prove that someone has entered legally, like the passport. But if someone is entering illegally, they will not have any kind of documentation, and hence they will fail to prove when they have entered into India, and that's why this bill will not work. That is a conclusion of the author. So what is the implicit assumption here? The implicit assumption is that apart from the use of documents, there is no other way in which a person can prove whether they have entered India on or before December 31st of 2014. So the author's assumption is that only documents can prove it. There is no other means of proving when someone has entered into India legally or illegally. So that is an assumption which is present within the argument of the author. So you can see clearly that then in a reading comprehension exercise, when the passage is a bit long, it can be a bit tricky to figure out what is the premise, what is the assumption, and what is the conclusion. And this is why critical reasoning questions pose one of the greater challenges inside reading comprehension questions as a whole. Right. So what I'm going to do is that moving forward, I'm going to discuss certain specific types of or generic types of arguments, and then talk about what are the implicit assumptions present in each of those types of arguments. Okay. So first type of argument is a cause and effect argument. So the author can say that A is the cause, then B will be the effect. In that case, the cause will become the premise and the effect will become the conclusion. Or the author can even flip this particular style of an argument and say that I know that B has happened. Right? The effect has taken place, which means that the cause should have taken place as well. So in this case, the author knows that the effect is existing, so it is a fact. So that is a premise, and the cause becomes a conclusion. Right? So in a cause and effect argument, it can be possible that the cause is a premise and the effect is a conclusion. Or it is possible that if the author knows that the effect has happened factually, then the effect can be the premise and the cause can be the conclusion. Now, inside cause and effect arguments, there are two different implicit assumptions which are always present. One is that there is only one effect for the given cause, or there is only one cause for the given effect. So if the author says that I know this effect has happened, so I can conclude that the cause must have taken place, then the author is saying basically that the effect could not have been brought about by some other cause. So the assumption is that there is a one-to-one mapping between the cause and the effect. That's the first assumption that is present inside cause and effect arguments. And second assumption which is present is that correlation implies causation, which means that if two things are happening one after the other, the author is then assuming that one should be the cause and the second should be an effect. Right? So if the author says that we have seen several different times that if A has happened, then immediately it has had an effect which is B. Then the author is saying that then A has been the causal event for B to happen. So the assumption also is that there is a connection between the cause and the effect. So correlation implies causation. This is a slightly tricky kind of an assumption to understand. So I've taken an example to explain it better. Okay. So if I look at this particular graph, right? So the graph shows you that the black graph is actually number of people who died by becoming tangled in their bed sheets. And the red graph is per capita cheese consumption. And we can see that the trends of both these graphs are kind of similar. When red increases, black also increases. When red decreases, black also decreases. So someone can look at this graph and say that per capita cheese consumption is the cause for people to die getting tangled in their bed sheets, because the graph shows that they are connected to each other. So when per capita cheese consumption increases, number of people who die by getting tangled in their bed sheets also increases. And that is why we should reduce the amount of cheese consumption. That can be an argument presented by someone. But the underlying assumption of this argument is that there is a causal link between per capita cheese consumption and number of people who died by becoming tangled in their bed sheets. But basic logic should tell us that this is merely coincidence, and actually eating cheese and dying by getting tangled in your bed sheets has got no connection whatsoever. So this is an assumption which is often present inside the cause and effect relation, which several people tend to ignore. That logically, is there a causal link which is present between the cause and the effect? Okay. So this is the first type of an argument, which is a cause and effect argument. Let me give you an example of an argument which has a cause and effect linkage. Okay. So this argument says toughened hiring standards have not been the primary cause of the present staffing shortage in public schools. The shortage of teachers is primarily caused by the fact that in recent years, teachers have not experienced any improvements in working conditions, and their salaries have not kept pace with salaries in other professions. So this entire argument here is a conclusion. The author is concluding that toughened hiring standards are not the cause for staffing shortage, but instead the cause for staffing shortage is that the teachers have not experienced any improvements in their working conditions, and their salaries have not kept pace with salaries in certain other professions. So the author is saying that this is A, the cause, for which this is the B effect. In this case, the effect becomes a premise because the effect has happened. And A becomes the conclusion that this is the cause and this is not the cause. Okay. So this is an example, typical example of a cause and effect relationship in which the effect is the premise and the cause is the conclusion. All right, moving on, the second type of argument is a planning type of an argument. Right? So in a planning type of an argument, what happens is the premise is an issue, is a problem which the author is wanting to solve. So the author will say that this problem exists. So the problem becomes the premise. And the conclusion is the plan. Right? The plan is the conclusion. The implicit assumptions that are always present in a planning type of an argument is that number one, the plan will definitely solve the problem, because that is an assumption, of course, because if the author is proposing a plan to tackle an issue or tackle the problem, then the author's assumption is that this plan will be effective. That is number one. And number two is that there is nothing else that we need to do apart from this plan. Right? So the author, if say the author does not acknowledge that there are certain other say boundary conditions which are required for the plan to be successful, the author is just saying that do this and you will solve the problem. Then the author is saying that keeping everything else around the problem constant, if we only execute the plan, our problem will get resolved. So the second implicit assumption present inside planning kind of arguments is that only the plan is required and nothing else. No other changes need to be made in the atmosphere or environment of the problem. Let's look at an example of a planning type of an argument. So yoga advocates say that few gymnast coaches require that their trainees who want to win medals in international events earmark some time for yoga every day. However, expertise in gymnastics requires tremendous concentration which yoga fosters. Thus, to help trainees succeed in competition, gymnast coaches should increase the time allotted for yoga for them. So this is the conclusion, that gymnast coaches should increase the time for yoga for, say, gymnasts. And the premise is that gymnastics requires tremendous concentration. So the problem which is present here is that the trainees need a lot of concentration and that particular issue needs to be solved. So because concentration is required for succeeding in gymnastics, to win medals in gymnastics, so the problem that the author is trying to solve here is to increase the concentration of athletes. And for that, the conclusion is, the plan is that yoga needs to be done and yoga's time allocation needs to be increased. So of course, the assumptions is that number one, yoga definitely helps increasing the concentration of athletes. Number two is that yoga is going to work for everyone. Nothing else, no other change in the entire training system, inside the entire training pedagogy of the coaches should change apart from increasing yoga or time allotted for yoga for concentration to improve. So this is a typical example of a planning argument to solve an issue. The third type of an argument is a sampling argument. Right? So sampling argument is basically like a survey. Right? So suppose, say, I want to understand why the customers of a particular product are not satisfied with that product. So what I can do is I can go into the market, I can survey about, say, 100 people. I can ask them what is the issue with the product. And then whatever conclusion I'm getting from those 100 people, whatever those 100 people are reporting me as the problem, I can say that from this data, I can say that this is the primary problem with my product. Right? So what I'm doing is, instead of asking everyone in the market who has bought the product, I'm looking at a small sample size of people. I'm particularly surveying them, getting their opinions, and I'm concluding that this is the major issue by extrapolating the results for everyone who has bought the product. So when a small samples data is used to come up with a generalized conclusion, then that is called a sampling type of an argument. The underlying implicit assumptions inside a sampling kind of an argument is that the sample is a good representation of the actual situation. Right? So suppose, say, my product is being sold all across the world, but I am only surveying people from, say, the southern part of India. Then my sample is actually very biased. I'm not looking at what all problems people are having across the world. I'm only conducting the survey on a particular demography. So then the sample that I picked up to survey is not a good representation of the actual situation, right? But if there is a sampling kind of an argument, the assumption is that the sample is a good representation of the actual situation. And second, of course, is that data collection was unbiased, right? For example, if I'm trying to find out what is the issue with a particular product, and I conduct the survey for only the people who are employees of that company which is manufacturing that, say, product, then whatever data I'm getting will be very biased towards the product. If I'm taking the sample from a set of people who are working for the competitor of that particular product, then this sample will be biased towards the opposite end of the product. So the assumption which is also present when coming up with a sampling argument is that the sample which has been selected is a very unbiased kind of a sample and will give you proper feedback, proper unbiased feedback about the product. Right? So this is an example of a sampling kind of an argument. So let's look at an example of sampling. So this says the book Art's Decline argues that European painters today lack skills that were common among European painters of preceding centuries. In this, the book must be right, since its analysis of 100 paintings, 50 old and 50 contemporary, demonstrates convincingly that none of the contemporary paintings are executed as skillfully as the older paintings. Right? So the conclusion is that of the book called Art's Decline, which is saying that today's painters lack skills and painters of preceding centuries had more skills. Right? And to come up with this conclusion, it took a sample of 100 paintings, 50 old and 50 contemporary or 50 new. And then looking at these paintings, it came up with a conclusion that yes, today's painters lack skills, which was present in painters of the older generation. Now, of course, the implicit assumption which is present inside this is that the 100 paintings have been selected in an absolutely unbiased fashion, and they are a very good representation of the old and the new paintings respectively. But say, suppose if the author had selected these paintings from the best 50 old paintings and the worst 50 contemporary paintings, then that sample is not a good representation of the actual situation. And also the sample is biased towards the conclusion that the author wants to come up with. So that is not being told to us. So the assumption present here is that all the 100 paintings are completely unbiased and completely a good representation of the old and the new paintings. Finally, the last common type of an argument is a comparison or an analogy type of an argument. Right? So what happens in these is that two different situations are analyzed to come up with a conclusion. So what I can do is that I can say that in the US, when the stock market fell or dropped, they took so and so measure to make sure that it again rose up. Right? So that is why whenever in India, the stock market is going to face a drop, then we should implement the same solutions. So this kind of an argument is a comparison type of an argument, because what I'm doing is I'm comparing the situation in US and India, and I'm saying that whatever worked in the US should work in India as well. Right? So the assumption which is implicit inside the comparison type of an argument is that the two situations that are being compared are very similar to each other. Right? So I'm assuming that whatever is the problem in the US stock market is the same problem which the Indian stock market is going to face. And that is why whatever worked there should work here as well. So that is a comparison type of an argument. And the assumption is, of course, that US and India are very, very similar to each other. Okay. So let's look at an example of a comparison argument as well. So this says that American athletes, many of whom have repeatedly won gold medals at the Olympics, take compound V as a supplement to increase their muscle mass. So this should be muscle mass, sorry, and metabolism. Indian coaches should also implement the same to improve our medal tally at the games. Okay. So again, they're comparing two different situations of the American athletes and the Indian athletes. And of course, the comparison is made on the set of assumptions that everything else that Indian athletes do and American athletes do are the same, apart from the fact that compound V was being taken by American athletes and compound V was not being taken by the Indian athletes. Okay. So this is a typical example of a comparison type of an argument. So these are generic type of arguments. Of course, you cannot categorize all of the arguments that you face in critical reasoning questions into one of these types, but having a knowledge of these can help you analyze an argument better. If you come across some of these arguments, you will immediately know what is an implicit assumption in this, what can be the premise in this type of an argument, and what can be a conclusion in this type of an argument. Moving on, I want to discuss first critical reasoning questions in papers, in non-CAT papers specifically, where they are given as separate questions. Right? There are non-CAT examinations like SNAP, like XAT, like IIFT, in which critical reasoning questions are asked as separate individual questions. And there are several different types of these critical reasoning questions. So I want just to run you through the different types of critical reasoning questions that are asked, and how do they look like, and what kind of skills or what kind of knowledge do you require to be capable of answering those questions successfully. The first and most important type of critical reasoning questions, which you will find in maximum number in quantity, is strengthening and weakening of arguments. So what will happen in these questions is that a particular argument with all three components, premise, assumption, and conclusion, will be given to you. And then the question will say that which of the following statements, if true, will strengthen the argument of the author, or which of the following statements, if true, will weaken the argument of the author. Okay. So what we are supposed to do inside this argument is that we have to first figure out, most importantly, what is the conclusion. In strengthening and weakening of arguments type of questions, identifying what is the conclusion becomes the component of the argument which is of the most paramount importance, right? Because why? Because what I have to do is that I have to assume every option to be true and reading the options and then thinking that if this is true, will it lead me to the same conclusion or will it lead me to the opposite conclusion? So if I'm looking to strengthen an argument, I'm looking for that particular option, which if true, gives me the same conclusion. Or if I'm trying to weaken an argument, then I'm looking for that particular option, which if true, leads me to the opposite conclusion. So strengthening and weakening of arguments in these type of questions of critical reasoning, conclusion is the most important point or part that we have to focus on. Okay. A small extension of strengthening and weakening type of arguments are strong and weak arguments. Strong and weak arguments also have as its most important component the conclusion of the particular argument. So let's understand how do these questions look like. So what will happen in these questions is that a particular argument of the author will be presented as a passage. Followed by that, you will have two statements, which will be arguments either for the conclusion which has been presented by the author or against the conclusion which has been presented by the author. Okay. So you'll be given two different statements which will be either arguing in support of whatever has been told to us by the passage or arguing against whatever has been told to us in the passage. And I will have to read the two arguments and I will have to evaluate whether these two statements given are strong arguments or weak arguments. So the choices will be like this. So the choices for these questions will be option A, first argument is strong, second argument is weak. Option B, first argument is weak, second argument is strong. Option C, both first and second arguments are strong. Option D, neither first nor second are strong arguments. Okay. So we have to basically evaluate the strength of the argument given in the two statements. So to figure out whether a particular statement is a strong argument or a weak argument, what we have to first evaluate and most importantly evaluate is that whatever conclusion is being reached by the options directly attacks or directly supports whatever conclusion the passage is reaching. So a strong argument is something which directly supports whatever has been said in the passage or directly attacks or say contradicts whatever has been given in the passage. A weak argument is something which supports say point B, which is related to point A. So B gets strengthened, there's a possibility that A also gets strengthened and where A is given inside the passage. So a particular argument which indirectly supports or indirectly contradicts whatever has been given in the passage will be a weak argument. So that is why, again, understanding the conclusion which is present in the argument is extremely important to evaluate whether the two statements are strong or weak, because I'm looking for direct relations with the conclusion to figure out whether the arguments which are given in the two statements are strong or weak. Next type of question, which is also very important type of critical reasoning questions, are implicit, explicit assumptions. Right? So, of course, the name itself should tell you that the most important component of the argument to be evaluated here is assumptions. So what will happen in these questions is that once again, you'll be given an argument, followed by that, you'll be given two different statements. First statement will have a set of an assumption. Second statement will also have an assumption. And the option choices will say statement 1 is implicit, statement 2 is explicit. Option B will say statement 1 is explicit, statement 2 is implicit. Option C will say that both statement 1 and 2 are implicit assumptions. Option D will say neither statement 1 nor statement 2 are implicit assumptions. So it can be this kind of a question, or the question might say by giving an argument that which of the following is an implicit assumption of the argument. So implicit assumption questions can be of several different types. Basically, this question determines whether a student is capable of understanding what kind of assumptions are implied inside the argument and what kind of assumptions have been explicitly mentioned by the author inside the argument. So this, of course, this question is completely dependent upon understanding what is the assumption used by the author. Fourth type of a question inside critical reasoning questions is a conclusion or inference type of a question. So basically what will happen in these questions is that a small argument will be given with a premise and a sense of an assumption. A conclusion to that argument may be given, may not be given. Why? Because the question will say that if the above passage is true, then what can you logically conclude from the above passage? So here, of course, conclusion, understanding the conclusion becomes very, very important in these kind of questions. So basically, you might be given a partial argument with a premise and an assumption, and you will be asked to determine what can be the most logical conclusion from the ones which are given in the options. So this is about logical deduction. You have to deduce from the passage which is given that which of the options will be the most logical conclusion or most logical inference that you can come up with. Okay. These kind of questions are generally easy if you know or if you have practiced a lot of reading comprehension exercises, because basically these kind of questions are like the inference based questions that you get in reading comprehension questions. Okay. And finally, the last type of critical reasoning question that you will find inside papers which have individual critical reasoning questions is a course of action question. Right? So course of action question is very, very similar to a conclusion or inference type of a question. Even here, the most important component that you need to focus on is the conclusion of an argument. Why? Because what will happen inside a course of action type of a question is that you will be asked to present a planning type of an argument. Right? So you will be posed with a problem. So the statement will say that this particular problem exists. And from the options, you have to pick up and say that which is the course of action which sounds most logical to deal with the problem at hand. So how will you solve the problem? Which of the options gives you the best possible way of solving the issue which is given? Right? So that is a course of action kind of an argument. So for this, you will have to come up with a conclusion for the problem which has been given to you. Right? One thing to remember to solve course of action problems correctly is that we will never take an extreme course of action. Right? For example, if say you are the boss of a particular company and the problem that is present in front of you is that there are two different employees who are having a lot of problems with each other, a lot of issues with each other. Now, one of the options says that course of action is fire both the employees. Okay. Then that will not be the right answer because that is an extreme action to take. Right? Just because two different employees have a lot of disagreements is not reason enough for you to fire both of them. Right? So course of action kind of questions, the answer or the option which will be correct will be a tempered action, which you can think about, gain as much information about the problem at hand, and then come up with a logical solution, which is going to be a pretty neutral solution to the problem. Right? So, of course, that requires a very good understanding or very good power of deduction to come up with a proper conclusion. Right? In fact, the extension of course of action questions is what the decision-making section of XAT is made up of. So course of action is an easier type of decision-making questions which are present in the XAT paper. So if you are writing an examination like NMAT, and if you understand how to answer course of action questions, then the same skill set will help you understand how to solve decision-making questions in XAT, which are just a bit more complex versions of the course of action type of questions. So these are the types of individual critical reasoning questions that you will come across when you're solving non-CAT papers especially. Okay. Apart from that, critical reasoning questions are also present interspersed inside reading comprehension questions, and anyone who has written CAT 2020 or has seen the CAT 2020 paper will actually realize that a lot of critical reasoning questions in all three sections or all three sessions of the CAT paper last year was asked. Okay. So let's understand that most of the critical reasoning questions which are present in CAT reading comprehensions will be strengthening and weakening type of questions. So let's look at the different types of critical reasoning questions and reading comprehensions that you might get in your CAT paper. Right? The standard question will be which of these options, if true, will strengthen the author's argument or will weaken the author's argument. Right? These are the simplest of the critical reasoning questions. You just have to understand the conclusion of the author and pick up from the choices that particular option which is again going to help you reach the same conclusion as the conclusion reached by the author. Okay. One thing to remember about critical reasoning questions is that, or critical reasoning questions reading comprehensions is that if you have a strengthening and weakening type of a question, then you have to assume whatever has been said in the option to be true. You cannot say that, but this doesn't make sense. Whatever is given in the option is false. You cannot do that. You have to assume whatever has been given in the option is true. And then assuming the options to be true, then you have to see that which of the options either helps you reach the same conclusion as that of the author or the opposite conclusion as that of the author. So the standard type of strengthening and weakening questions is going to be the easy critical reasoning questions in reading comprehensions. The tough ones are going to be phrased like this. It is going to say that which of these is true does not strengthen or weaken the author's argument. So if the question says that which of the following options, if true, does not strengthen the author's argument, then I am not necessarily looking for an option which is weakening the author's argument, but I am actually also looking for options which does nothing to the conclusion reached by the author. So if a particular option helps you reach a conclusion which is not exactly opposite of what has been given by the passage, but it is just reaching some other conclusion which is not related to something that is given in the passage, even that option does not strengthen the author's argument. So this is something the students have to keep in mind. So if the question says that which of these, if true, does not strengthen, then I am not looking for something which definitely weakens. I might even be looking at options which does not help me reach any conclusion which is close to whatever has been reached by the author of the passage. And finally, the downright cruel type of critical reasoning questions that you can get inside a reading comprehension exercise is going to look like this: that which of these, if false, does not strengthen or weaken the author's argument. The problem with these questions is that there's a double negative. Which of these, if false, does not strengthen the author's argument? So what you have to do is that when you're reading the options, you have to keep both these negatives in mind. So firstly, whatever option you're reading, you have to consider that option to be false, which means that you have to read the option and you'll have to formulate the opposite of that option in your head. Then that particular opposite option which is present in your head, you have to consider that to be true, and then see that if that is true, then you have to see that whether that particular argument will strengthen or weaken the author's argument or not. So there's a double negative. So you have to first consider the option to be false, which means you have to create the false option in your head. Then you have to consider that false option to be true. Then you have to see that whether it is strengthening the author's argument, weakening the author's argument, or is neutral and does not contribute to the conclusion of the author's argument or not. So since so many steps need to be performed with respect to each and every one of these options, so these type of questions are going to take up a lot of time, and it's going to create a lot of confusion in your head while you're solving questions of these type. And in CAT 2020 paper, every session, the morning, afternoon, and evening session of the paper had one of these downright cruel critical reasoning questions present inside them, which is one of the reasons why the CAT 2020 VRC section was one of the toughest in the last, say, couple of decades of CAT. Okay. So I would encourage all of you to go back to the CAT 2020 paper whenever you have time, and then pick up these questions once and try to answer them, and you will realize how much time it takes. And then you will understand how to develop a mentality for questions of this type. So this is what I wanted to basically communicate about critical reasoning questions in this video. Hope it has been a bit helpful for all of you to understand what are critical reasoning questions, what do the questions entail, and what kind of approach is required to get to the answers of the questions. Remember, it's all about successfully recognizing what is the premise, assumption, and conclusion. After that, the questions of critical reasoning type become pretty simple to get to the answer of. With that, I'll conclude the video here. So thank you everyone for watching, and hit the like button if you found this video helpful. Thank you.